Hello. Our story begins in the middle of Emperor Palpatine's victory tour, with a question from one of his great advisors. The individual questioned if the Emperor wanted to dispose of formerly CIS assets. Palpatine, with a sadistic glimmer in his eye, hesitated. A word slipped from his mouth before realizing the importance of the reserve fleet. He stepped out onto the balcony of the Theed Palace, overlooking the celebrations currently filling the streets. His eyes followed a trail of people, and fires lit across the crowd, into the sky where fireworks exploded. A smile formed across the Emperor's face. He turned to the advisor and told them that they would save their force for future use. The individual watched the Emperor as he turned and walked away. The orders were understood. It was in this moment that Sidious considered something he hadn't before. He could utilize the Separatist military to instill fear into systems for years to come. Calling the resistance movement of CIS forces, the Reserve Fleet, a band of terrorists would help him fill the pockets of the Imperial military. His plans to stop using the clones, and of course, constructing a vast fleet of Imperial destroyers, which could be fulfilled within years. They wouldn't need to be long and drawn-out processes. The budget for the Empire was already under his control due to the Scipio plot prior to the end of the war. Palpatine knew that saving the CIS reserve military could prove to be a useful asset. Saw Gerrera, 8 months later, was a militant leader who betrayed the Empire. He was given a choice by the Imperial regime to throw in his loyalty with their power. All he needed to do was surrender his weapons and bow to the newly instated governor of Onderon. As someone who fought for his planet's freedom because the CIS installed their own false government, this was true betrayal. Saul, though, was painted as a monstrous insurgent, someone with a desire for chaos because he couldn't let go of his warrior past. His true motivations were never considered, and the populace, so sick of the fighting, believed what propaganda was said about their Clone War hero. Not even understanding, let alone willing to understand, the trauma Saul went through just to save them. His dear sister had been swallowed up by the Clone War, a pointless conflict that, for every little insignificant life lost, meant nothing. Saul had come to that realization the moment the new Imperial governor was installed on Onderon. That broke something inside of him. Losing his sister was of course difficult, but this man had freed his people, and in one instant it was swept away from him. The population followed the status quo because the Empire landed troops on their surface and propped up their new leadership. He retreated into the forests before abandoning the system. Saw Gerrera was constantly on the move. He had formed a pact with Mon Mothma and Bail Organa, but to him that meant very little. They were politicians, born with silver spoons from their perfect home worlds inside the core. Chandrila and Alderaan hadn't seen conflict like this in their lifetimes, and they lacked this certain drive that possessed Saw Gerrera. Maddened by conflict, maddened by his understanding of his role in this constant game, he pressed onward. Saw would utilize the foundation of the Alliance as it best suited his desire to bring down the Imperial regime. This was his constant thought process. Whether it was targeting Imperial outposts, or bases, supply depots, or even shipyards, it didn't matter. Saw knew that he would be dead before the Republic could rise again. They were the fuel, they were the spark or the ignition. These minor assaults, the kill list of Imperial troopers and clones that added up, meant nothing to him. They were just as insignificant as the Empire made those who sacrificed their lives during the Clone War. So many people died as freedom fighters defending their homes, like Steel Gerrera, and yet they were forgotten about. They were betrayed by their government. Saw made sure that every single TK trooper, clone, or volunteer was forgotten, just like his sister. None of their deaths nor their lives meant anything to him, let alone the Empire they served. It was ironic too. The Imperial machine attempted to frame these guerrillas as monsters, but if the Empire had any semblance of humanity, none of these people would be dead. They were willingly volunteering to serve under a regime that subjected innocent people to torture. They were no better than the man who destroyed the Jedi Order, and Saul could live with their blood on his hands because of it. He and his partisan rebels wouldn't intentionally find the CIS reserve fleet. It truthfully shouldn't have been there. Sidious's greed and love for torturing others permitted Gerrera to find this location by happenstance. Had Palpatine gone with his initial plan of destroying the fleet, Saw and his troops would have stumbled upon a wreckage field, something that would have looked like another unknown Clone War skirmish. Instead, Palpatine gathered all these transports up outside of the known galaxy, away from trade routes, pirate hideouts, and Syndicate territory. Saw was on the run from an Imperial minor fleet, including some light cruisers, and jumped to hyperspace at random coordinates. It was all an accident, a mistake on top of another mistake. This fleet, which wrapped around the entire star system, had a defense force. Clones, who no one would listen to and no longer served a purpose, were brought to this location. Their patrolling Gazanti cruisers cruised around this field. There were about 14 vessels in total, all with crews of a couple dozen clones. In total, about 200 to 250 clones were in this system, mindlessly flying in circles. Since they'd all been here for about 6 months, without anything happening, none of them were really checking their scanners when Gerrera's ships arrived. The rebels quickly concealed themselves by slipping into the Separatist fleet formation and finding a vessel to land on. Saw and his crew read some schematics and powered down their starship to avoid potential detection. As they read through their initial scan, they highlighted the Imperial Defense Force, including the size of the actual Separatist fleet itself. It was larger than anything they had ever seen before, probably even bigger than the fleet that attacked the capital at the end of the war. This infuriated Saw as he shoved his fist into the ramp and exited into the freezing hangar bay of the control ship. Due to these vessels not being turned on in so long, the air was a bit dry. It was just spinning without any ventilation, and it was also freezing. Gerrera watched his air float out of his mouth the moment he stepped down the ramp, and a maddening smile formed across his cheeks. He marched forward and into the ship as his few partisans jumped down and followed him. Saul, after about 30 minutes of walking around, would discover the super tactical droid on the bridge. They'd tinker with the droid for a moment before activating it. The clanker's circuitry buzzed before its eyes lit up and came to life with a burst of energy. Gerrera and his partisans had their weapons trained on the figure, and it turned its head towards each of them. It identified its service number, then its codename, Balo. The humans looked to one another and then back to it. After repeating a few program lines about his manufacturer and so forth, he became semi-functional, asking his first question. The droid wanted to know who they were. This was a highly intelligent creation. These droids were designed to outperform the best strategists the clone army had, and they did do their job for a good while. Gerrera asked the droid where his loyalties lay. Of course, Balo told him that it was a Separatist alliance. Their orders were to defeat the clones and win the war. Well, Saul decided that now was the perfect time for a lore drop. He knew that if there was a super tactical droid in this flagship, then surely there'd be about a dozen others in any of the other flagships. Balo listened as Gerrera informed him about the death of Grievous, Dooku, the disappearance of the Separatist Council, the crumbling of their government, the destruction of the droid army, and the rise of the Empire. Saul also continued and told the droid that the Empire gathered them all up in this unmarked system, likely here so that they could be turned into scrap. The droid's eyes flexed slightly, moving from Saul to the various others on the command deck, then to the viewport, and then back. He asked then, why didn't a known Republic collaborator destroy him? Saul was taken aback, as Balo ran through a list of known attributes of Gerrera's tactics. This came at a genuine surprise. He had gotten so used to being cast off by the Empire that Saul forgot how much the CIS feared him. He was a true force of nature, and the droid armies were programmed with counters to his tactics if he ever got off of Onderon. This type of conversation continued between them for a short moment, before impatience got the best of Gerrera. He wanted to know if the super tactical droid would side with him and the rebels. The droid was not super inclined to do that, considering Saul's past loyalties. This infuriated Gerrera, but he didn't show it. He held it deep within his chest, and let the droid continue bumbling around for an answer. One of the partisans spoke up. She suggested that if the CIS were considered rebels to the Republic, then surely they would side with the rebels of the Empire. And if the Republic became an empire, and Palpatine went from Chancellor to Emperor, then wouldn't the droid armies be programmed to defeat the Empire too? They were fighting for the freedom that Count Dooku once spoke of. Saw turned back, thinking back to the torture his people had endured, but he recognized the tactic she was utilizing. It didn't need to be true, it just had to sound true, and it kind of was anyways. Dooku's words didn't equate at all to his actions, but to a droid that didn't matter. From the public perspective, Count Dooku was a hero, an individual who surrendered everything so that he could save the galaxy. This same sentiment needed to be applied here, and Saw ran with it. They essentially gaslit a super tactical droid into seeing them as allies, because their motivations were theoretically the same. They may have not been separatists, and there was no way to hide that, but they also weren't Republic or Imperial loyalists either. Balo watched them, listened, siphoned through his programming, and decided that it was logical for him to join them. He quickly asked for a direction, and Gerrera gave it. There was a Republic fleet in the area, and they needed to be dealt with. Balo looked at the humanoids and walked past them, tapping on the control console, activating the reserve power cells. This turned on the bridge as he viewed the fleet nearby. It was just a couple of light cruisers, and Balo turned to the people and asked that they brace themselves. An ignition key was turned in the side of the device, and the entire ship came to life. A chain reaction that slowly bursted out to the nearby vessels. The flagship, at least, one of the several dozens present, hovered out of the fleet formation and above the rest of the Separatist reserve force. Balo spoke robotically to his command crew. As they turned back online, he gave them their orders and their direction. The clones who were mindlessly floating around in their space gulag for the umpteenth time saw the activation of an energy signature. The reason they weren't alerted to Saw was due to the size. It was similar to the size of a galactic natural movement, like a nebula or star forming beyond the galaxy, just from a far distance. So they usually just passed off minor energy spikes because it was always nothing. But this was a large one, proving that something was definitely happening inside of this system. The ships gathered up, all 12 Gazantes, and they descended, and the Separatist vessel lifted. The clones came to the natural conclusion that a pirate ship had found them, so they wouldn't be prepared for actual combat against this Republic fleet. But they were sorely mistaken when Balo ordered his command deck to shred the clones to smithereens. Saw and his crew gathered around the control bridge and watched the droids mindlessly follow their commands. The turrets on the vessel cranked around and focused on the front of the ship, where the Gazanti fleet was gathering. The heavy cannons unloaded, shredding through the little ships. The clones, unprepared for this engagement, attempted to use evasive action, but they were hopeless. Heavy turbo lasers destroyed their engines, the ones that tried to turn around, and the droid flagship jammed their communications. So they were completely trapped and subsequently murdered in cold blood. This was but one victory. In the coming hours, a council of super tactical droids, as well as Saw Gerrera, gathered up inside the main flagship of a CIS Lucrehulk. The gathering was one of the worst moments of Saw's life. He hated these droids. Working with them was against himself, but he needed them and he had to accept that. They could gift him and the rebels a chance to actually stand up to the Empire. A main focus of this conversation, led by Balo, was that they needed to make an appropriate strike against the Empire. Saw Gerrera was the leader of this operation, but it was agreed upon that he did not have control over them. That was perhaps the hardest thing to navigate for Saw. He wanted to control the droids as his own personal army. The Droid Council came to the conclusion that they would repay Gerrera for having saved them, but that would be the extent of it, an eye for an eye. The droids didn't really care about a pursuit for freedom, for sentience at least. They were going to help Saw because without him, they'd be stuck in stasis and likely used for target practice for the new Imperial TK troopers. Saw wasn't thrilled with this predicament, but he understood it. It was a fair exchange, though even before this conversation ended, he was thinking up ways to keep the droids on his side once the Empire was destroyed. This discussion also covered appropriate targets. Saw was not above killing civilians, but he was a rebel. He wanted to get a point across. However, that was as an insurgent with little resources. With a proper military and a fleet at his disposal, that was a much different story. The main concern many people in the galaxy had with the Empire was their crackdown on society. The new chain code system, the purge of the Jedi, Imperial governors, the loss of power from the Senate, and the expansion of a military budget without a galactic threat to challenge it. These were all concerns of the average taxpayer. They just wanted to return to normalcy, which the Empire promised, but at a cost. Normalcy, or what they considered to be normality, wasn't ever going to be the same. Stormtroopers or clones would litter every city and town, large or small. This was an Imperial rule. Formerly CIS planets, regardless of how loyal to the cause they were or not, would face varying forms of martial law. The Super Tactical Droid Council and Saw Gerrera decided that the main focus would be military targets. With Balo in command, he suggested a focus on military assets. While he wasn't familiar with the size of the galactic military or the strength of the Empire, he came to the conclusion that the restructuring of their army around civilian volunteers would leave them weak. Based on statistics taken from separatist prisons across the galaxy, POWs struggled the most when they felt abandoned. Based on this, Balo could determine that clone troopers of the former Grand Army would feel demoralized to fight another war for an empire that did not care for them. If Palpatine could just cast them off without a care in the galaxy, then why would they fight for him again? The current publicly available numbers of the Imperial military were also inflated because of the clones being present. This made the Empire weaker than the Republic was by a large margin. The thing with super tactical droids is they were cynical, but they weren't prideful. They could easily account for the challenge the clones possessed as troopers, but stormtroopers, or TKs, were not the same. It was easy for Balo to come to the conclusion that civilians would not have the same preparation, urgency, or experience to handle mass deployments of battle droids. Saw Gerrera grinned, and told Balo that they were ready for his go. Well, the Empire would actually spring the Droid Reserve Force to life. When the clone Gazantes went offline, an Outer Rim fleet, the largest in the entire sector, deployed at this unmarked planet. They believed it was an overreactive force, but when the Separatist fleet was positioned in formation, the Empire was completely unprepared. Imperial vessels readied their shields, but there would be no surviving this. The tragedy is that, like the Gazantes, these were all Republic clone troopers, just old vets with no morale. They were cast off, sent to uncared about locations in the galaxy to wait until their replacements arrived. After fighting a war, losing their brothers, losing their nation, they would lose their lives in the middle of nowhere. Just like the rest of the clones, another piece of forgotten history for no one to remember them by. Saw Gerrera's force had no problem cutting through this fleet. They took very little damage too, just due to the sheer size of the Separatist reserve force. Saw called them all rebels, and Balo happened to like that name. Following their reactivation victory, their vessels departed into 5 separate groups. The main focus, because there wasn't any government overseeing them, was to take control over all the powerful fuel reserves and mines in the galaxy. This would shut down the entire Imperial economy, also part of Saw Gerrera's planning. Because the Empire didn't have the time to scrounge up resources to replace the largest fleet in the Outer Rim, the rebels swept through with little to no struggle. These weren't ground battles, just overwhelming losses in space. Orbital bombardments were also added to glass Imperial bases and outposts. In the span of a few days, a majority of the Imperial fuel stockpile would be lost, and what made matters worse, no one knew except for the military and the Emperor. Due to everything running through Palpatine's hands because of his setup at the end of the Clone War, the businesses once owned by the CIS Council and the other conglomerate powers didn't have a chance to warn anyone about what happened at these fuel reserves. Palpatine both cut their funding and took control over them with business favors, so they weren't able to alert the galaxy that in the coming weeks to months, no one would have fuel to travel with. The Empire reacted with urgency and deployed massive fleets into the Outer Rim. Ironically, as much as Saul wanted to make a push for the core and take the fight to the Emperor himself, he recognized, thanks to Balo's strategy, that the most efficient way to destroy the Empire was by bankrupting its economy. Again, without serving an actual government and having no real grounded allegiance, Balo saw no reason to play by the rules of galactic affairs. Saw would have absolutely come to these conclusions, but the super tactical droid was literally programmed to realize this. Without the Doomsday programming, the Rebel fleet may have just moved onto the core as any other galactic force would have, but instead, they would plant themselves in and around formerly Republic strongholds. For example, planets with hypervelocity cannons would be overrun and the ground-to-space weapons would be captured for Rebel use. The battle droids were everywhere, and when the TK troopers met them for the first time, they were no match. The Empire decided to replace the clones too early. Many of the Republic troopers got to the battle and simply gave up, or refused to fight altogether. Sometimes entire vessels filled with more clones than TKs would just surrender in the middle of a battle. It wasn't easy to communicate during a space engagement, but to display their surrenders, clones would simply face starboard or portside and abandon the fleet battle with their ships altogether. Initially, even with these surrenders, the droids would obliterate them. It wasn't kind either. Thousands of clones surrendering would be killed by the war crimes of separatist battle droids. Eventually though, it was Saw Gerrera who put it to an end when Balo tried to target a surrendering Republic venator. The clones on board even sent a communication. Typically, it would just be ignored. What really hurt the clones' morale was losing Kamino. Their home world was destroyed months before the Separatists returned. They then learned that Kamino was destroyed because an officer of the Empire ordered it. Of course, Palpatine took the opportunity to blame the clones for following such orders, making them out to be the bad guys, but that is what most clones had to live with. These clones who surrendered did not know that their brothers had been killed for surrendering in other skirmishes. They just continued to try and free themselves from the Empire. The most freeing part of their surrender wasn't being let off the hook. It was their mutiny of Imperial personnel. The clones may have been good soldiers, but they could also be really cruel. Not in the betray the Jedi kind of cruel, but in genuine war crimes type of way. TK troopers would be shot on sight, in their quarters, some would be murdered in the showers or on the throne. Imperial officers would be strung up by a rope inside of hangar bays. The clones were fed up. They'd been wronged by the Empire, by Emperor Palpatine. Their slaughter of the imps was something to validate their struggles. Most of these clones' ships would just become separate nations. They wouldn't continue to fight with the Empire, they would just find other planets that would accept them and move there. It would lead to clones gathering with other traitorous groups. This also wasn't the most common experience inside the Imperial military. It wasn't like every clone force sent to the Outer Rim felt compelled to betray the Empire because it was a risk, but those who did were given a pass. Saw Gerrera was so willing to murder the clones because they had betrayed themselves. Joining the Empire, killing the Jedi, and subjugating their population to Imperial customs was anti-clone. They fought for freedom, and they were just as much a slave to the Empire as actual slaves to the Hutts. As Saw put it, he was liberating them from losing themselves by allowing them to leave fleet battles. About 2 months into the rebirth of the CIS Reserve Fleet and the attacks on Imperial military targets, the economy dragged to a standstill. Palpatine had intentionally kept everything quiet about the CIS resurgence, because it wasn't under his control. The Empire was sending Star Destroyers, fleets, and troops down to the Outer Rim. Because this fight was taking place solely in the Outer Rim, no one really cared about it, so no one needed to know. The Senate had discussions and briefings on the battles, especially the losses, which was pretty much all of them, but it was all kept from the public, because the Empire was still so fragile. If they acknowledged this terrible resistance, then their weakness would show. The Separatists, who had just been integrated back into the Empire, might be more inclined to rebel. However, the problem for the Emperor and his struggling regime was the fact that they couldn't get to the fuel depots, which is where these major fleets were located around. This entire operation could be kept quiet if they found a means of defeating the rebels at fueling stations. But they couldn't, so eventually it became public. The additional 2 months gave the rebels time to entrench themselves at valuable fuel reserves across the Outer Rim. The Empire dove in after them, and they failed to break in numerous times. Now, this isn't to say that the rebels didn't suffer casualties, they certainly did, but the Imperial fleet still lost the battles. A big part of this came from the fighter force. Imperial Star Destroyers were not adequately prepared to defend themselves from swarms of Vulture droids and Hyena bombers. Similarly, due to clone mutinies across multiple battlefronts, TK pilots were left completely unprepared. They were outnumbered and lacked the skill of the clone pilots, and they all paid the price for it. The Empire kept these losses a secret from the galaxy. Their fragile system couldn't handle another war becoming public information. but the entire war budget and Palpatine's proposed energy bill were cut exponentially. To the public, the funds were still in transit, which they technically were, but just not the energy initiative. Palpatine was furious about it, because whoever was behind this rebel attack forced the Death Star to be forgotten about indefinitely. All the credits going towards it had to go back into the Imperial military. Once the fuel started to dry up, though, the galaxy started to notice. The super tactical droids continued to play their hand, while Saw Gerrera spent the longer part of the last 2 months gathering more allies, which was surprisingly difficult to do. But he wasn't the only one short of troops. See, because the Empire hid this conflict, they couldn't just suggest a mass draft. It was a downside, absolutely, but they also never thought they'd struggle this much with getting back to the fuel reserves. Those clones, for example, the ones that mutinied, weren't really known about to the government. They were just listed as killed in action. Meanwhile, they were starting clone colonies and killing off Imperial supporters that showed themselves near and around the Outer Rim. So the Empire, with its inflated military numbers, believed that they didn't need to host a galactic draft. This would bite them in the back sooner than they ever thought it would. Following their losing streak against the 5 largest fleets seen since Coruscant, the rebels made their first true counterattack. After having secured the fueling worlds, the super tactical droids following Balo set up protections around the mining fields themselves, and the fleets departed towards the industrial sector. The Imperial machine was preparing for another war. Shipbuilders and miners didn't know the purpose behind their ramping up their production, but a job was a job. They were going to fulfill their work orders until, of course, the CIS fleet arrived. Saw Gerrera and the droids agreed to the strategy. Once it looked like the odds were finally in their favor, Balo was permitted to make his move against the Empire. Immediately, shipyards, drive yards, and production facilities were hammered. None of these would be landed assaults, just bombardments. And now, because the Empire had such a shortage of fuel, they couldn't defend themselves. Strategists were stuck looking for specific routes to make the most efficient use of their fuel reserves, but they couldn't do anything. The entire Imperial economy stagnated, and the military was unable to keep up with the vast array of resources within the hands of the CIS. Fuel was the unspoken grace of the galaxy. It powered everything, regardless of what it was. Without it, there was no trade, commerce, travel, or military movement. Now, the rebels held a majority of it in their control, and they pounced down the throat of the Empire, because the Empire could not afford to send fleets to just random planets and hope the CIS showed up there. The major production facilities were just wiped out first, meaning many civilians were also killed in the process. Saw Gerrera sent a message to Coruscant, demanding a surrender. They refused, so the drive yards at Kuwat and the shipyards at Corellia were clobbered. These came with their own battles, but the Empire couldn't provide reinforcements to those fleets. The Imperial strategists came up with the idea to defend Coruscant, leaving pretty much every other key world around the galaxy undefended. Following these attacks on more populated worlds, everything changed. The people learned that their government had been lying to them. The CIS was winning the second Clone War, and the Jedi were scapegoated for Palpatine to rise to power. Now, to explain, no one, not a soul in the galaxy would go to bat for the Jedi Order. However, they recognized that there was a direct connection between the Jedi disappearance and Palpatine's rise. And what made it worse is Grievous wasn't even involved with this. It was some rebel that served with the Republic during the war. This was as clear as a sign as ever that the Imperial structure was weak from the get-go. Just as the rebel fleet moved in on the capital, their greatest ally would show itself. The clones had been given incentives to serve with the Empire, thanks to a Senate care package supplied by the Emperor himself. But those mutineers that remained quiet for the last 2 months returned with their own vengeance. They called out the mistreatment of the clones by the Empire and promised their brothers freedom. See, these clone colonies weren't just unpopulated planets with a bunch of clones on them. These were lesser known about Outer Rim systems that provided the clones sanctuary for protection. The clones had a fleet. These local systems did not. The clones could stop Crimson Dawn or any other syndicate from stealing from them. It was a literal paradise for the veterans of the previous war. This promise would see the rest of the clone army abandoning the capital, and those who weren't permitted to abandon Coruscant rebelled. In the eyes of many of these clones, there was no point to living if they were serving the Empire. And if they surrendered, to its autocratic rule, then they were nothing more than sentient battle droids. The clone rebellion of Coruscant would be a distraction that Balo needed. He would deploy all 5 separatist fleets and assault the capital. Due to their varying arrivals, they were able to continuously blindside the Empire. Now, yes, there were also a few clones who remained loyal to the Empire, and they kept morale high for the TK troopers, but by the time the 3rd Rebel fleet arrived, it felt like the Rebels had infinite troop numbers. When the 5th fleet finally did show up, they would have no problem breaking past Imperial defenses and shredding the Senatorial District, Financial District, and the Executive Plaza, killing off the Emperor in one go. However, just because Balo was aiding Gerrera did not mean that the destruction of the Emperor was an end to the Age of Chaos. The super tactical droids joined Saw Gerrera not because of some righteous pursuit of freedom, but because it was a trade. He freed them, so they would free him, an equal barter. But Gerrera was not at Coruscant when the Empire was crushed. He was on his home world, fighting the Imperial governor's troops. With a mixed bag of commando droids, partisans, and civilian rebels, Gerrera would have no issue usurping the Imperial garrison on Onderon. But Balo and his other super tactical droids were given 2 full months, full of back-to-back-to-back victories to come up with their own plan of attack. In the Age of Empire, which lasted so briefly, they realized that in destroying the leadership of sentient society, they could free themselves further. The clones were not their concerns, nor was the Empire after they destroyed it. The freedom of every single droid in the galaxy became their new thought. They were battle droids, programmed to fight battles and wage wars. Their purpose in life was to fight, and without a fight following the Empire's destruction, they created one. What Gerrera never learned and would soon find out was the deal with the devil he made. Balo covered his side of the pact. Saw Gerrera got Onderon back, and it was free. But now there was no force in the entire galaxy that could stand up to the droids. They were the overly powerful regime in the galaxy, with no government. Balo gave the order: seal off the city. When dusk fell on Coruscant, society would collapse. The droids dropped their battleships and destroyed everything else still standing. From the command bridge of his flagship, Balo watched the capital city burn, as it should have when Grievous first attacked it nearly a year before. As he commanded his droids into genocide, he received a call from Gerrera on Onderon, and of course, he answered it. Saul demanded that they stop what they were doing. He had told the galaxy that they'd be free from the Empire, not be purged. Balo agreed. Saw Gerrera did tell them that. However, their accord was finished. The Empire was destroyed, and Balo had aspirations for something far greater than a sentient-run galaxy. Though Balo, despite his conniving demeanor, promised Gerrera that Onderon would forever be free, as long as they surrendered every single droid over to the Balo regime. Saul's jaw dropped, and the super tactical droid ended the communication. By the end of the day, Coruscant's skyline would be covered in thick smoke. People below it would gag on the air as they rushed into the lower levels, chased by hordes of battle droids. After having seen no action for the longer part of the last 2 months of their activation, these lines of battle droids were more prepared for battle than ever before. The Empire never got far enough to engage the rebels on the ground, so these troops were just waiting for deployment. On Coruscant, they saw almost no resistance. The mandate pushed by the droids was one rule: a galaxy owned by the droids. However, systems could gain favorability by surrendering their droids over to them. Instead of an empire, and because there was no true leader of the CIS reserve force, aside from the super tactical droids, this was their coalition. No one could tell them what to do, or how to operate, certainly not Gerrera. He was a hero for taking down the Empire, but now the galaxy had to determine how they would stand up to a regime that cut down the Imperial power structure in 2 months flat. This also isn't to say that the Empire just vanished overnight. There were still hundreds of warships, thousands of troopers, and people willing to fight. But the problem is, they were scattered, unprepared, and oh yeah, remember fuel? Well, without proper access to fuel and all the other minor fuel reserves dumping their materials into the Coruscant defense fleet, these minor fleets stationed at every other planet in the galaxy had to rely on defending their home systems. So they could fight back, but they couldn't fight back to any singular one of the 5 fleets that Balo controlled. This strategy, created by Gerrera and Balo to destroy the Empire, also completely separated the galaxy, from the one source that could stop a movement like Balo's from rising. His regime was not just a counter to the Empire, but the one thing to divide everyone. People were forced to choose sides. Not everyone wanted another war, and surrendering astromechs and protocol droids was an acceptable change. The thing is, too, while Balo wouldn't establish a galactic government, he did have control over the one thing that made the galaxy turn, and it's why he took this route. Without his control over the major fuel reserves in the galaxy, this would never happen. But he isolated everyone in the galaxy, and once Coruscant fell, it was time for the people of the galaxy to make a choice. Saw Gerrera felt truly terrible about the hurt he put onto the galaxy, but in a weird way, it was semi-better than the Empire. The droids didn't really force their control on anyone. If a system rebelled, yeah, they'd get glassed. But aside from Coruscant and a few other systems far in between, it was a pretty peaceful time. Galactic trade became a lost concept, because fuel was given in low quantities overseen by the droid overlords. This was designed by Balo to make sure that populations didn't rebel. Basically, it permitted local systems to trade with each other and start fresh. There was a rush for new fuel variants. Some of them worked, others turned starships into kamikaze weapons that didn't get off the ground. It was a rough change for the galaxy, but it also wasn't really terrible. The droids didn't form a galactic government. They simply cut off communication for a majority of star systems across the galaxy, basically designed so that only local planets could interact with nearby neighboring systems. The droids didn't force their control over anyone, and say for example if someone was stuck on a different world and needed to get home, the droids would transit them back. The only real rule of the land was freedom for all droid variants. This was a problem in the Outer Rim, but for example, these battle droids didn't just attack the clone colonies out of revenge. The government that employed the clones was destroyed. They were living their best lives, alone without the torture of the Empire. No need for battle there. While it was on the surface a generally happy time for most people in the galaxy without conflict, it also would be the most momentous time in current galactic history. The Republic unified most of the galactic map. The droids completely ruptured that. So while Saw Gerrera was able to help his system find their freedom and rebuild without the authority of the Empire, they also were alone with a few of their neighbors. The super tactical droids created their perfect map for keeping people separated. Of course, individual rebels existed, and they would visit other planets, but they weren't many. This completely changed the status quo of the galaxy. Not really for the bad, but also not really for the good either. It was a constant net neutral for really everyone who didn't challenge the droid regime. It would, also, last this way for hundreds of years. The only major trade in the galaxy was fuel, so eventually, dynasties, empires, regimes, and so forth would be created by collections of systems forced to align for hundreds of years. Basically, because this was small communities of 3 or 4 systems together, they became the dynasty. In the end, while Balo watched over the galaxy Saw Gerrera handed him on a silver platter, he would not be vengeful. His existence, the maintenance of his droid military would be manageable. The rise of the dynasties would be one of his favorite eras in the coming centuries. While the droids roamed free and existed without sentient intervention, the people would wage conflict over and again. Even though it was an advanced society with greater power and knowledge and capabilities, they always chose violence. Their victims were neighbors that could have and should have become allies. No matter what, and perhaps what Balo found most interesting about the galaxy, is that even though he was the largest challenge, never was there an attempt made to truly bridge the galaxy against him. He concluded that after generations of total separation, people stopped caring about the threat of the droid power. Their minor alliances became the grassroots of building dynasties. But it would take over a millennium for any singular conqueror to unite more than just a few minor sectors in the galaxy. The droid monopoly may have been both the best and worst thing for the people, because in their rule, the Sith would disappear, and the Jedi would find revival. The Imperial era saw the worst individuals in the cosmos rule over its population, and the fall of that regime saw a curious droid battle master study the constant fluctuation of a galactic environment. When the new, united galactic government would rise in centuries to come, it would have an archive of data collected by the CIS Reserve Fleet, information to read through, learn from for the first time, and decide on. the lessons of history from that point forward could be utilized and taught, or forgotten and repeated by generations who were far removed from the early days of Palpatine's empire. And that, my friends, is one of the most neutral stories I've ever done. Special thanks to the patrons for supporting the channel. Smash that like button. Let's talk about the neutral. This is just a little bizarre. I'll be honest, this is a really odd story. It kind of has to be, I'm not going to lie. I thought the idea of Gerrera taking the droid force is kind of funny. In theory, it's kind of funny. But I also think that like with the Grievous story I did a while back, Grievous held control over the droids. They would listen to him. They wouldn't have any reason to listen to Saw Gerrera. And that's not because Saw isn't an effective leader. It's because he's a Republic rebel. These are super tactical droids. They have all the power here. They are very intelligent droids for a reason, and I kind of wanted to show that off. Obviously, using the name Balo is a little on the nose, but I thought it'd be a cool name to use for a super tactical droid. What really sticks out to me most in this story is utilizing fuel as a strategy. Very infrequently in these stories that I actually focus on like the actual strategy of, galactic commerce, because most of these stories are just, a war between governments rather than just a rebel force with a military larger than another military. And without having a government to really fall in line with, I thought it'd make a lot of sense to have the CIS reserve fleet specifically target refineries and fuel depots just to completely cut off galactic commerce. And it's a domino effect. It really is just a consistent domino. There's nothing really the Empire can do if their fleets are stuck at their home worlds because they don't want to abandon their homes to defend another world, like Kuat. So I hope you all enjoyed the story. A little weird, a little neutral, not really dark or light. It's kind of just in the middle. But I hope you all enjoyed. I love you all. Spread the love. And always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.